lot of the interesting research in database talks about how you can look at, I don't like the word neutral data set, but you can look at a data set that is just kind of like purely constructed, and people will read things into it based on their prior beliefs. And you can look at the same data set and see entirely different stories just based on your prior beliefs, your prior background.
Welcome back to the Insights by Design podcast. We're excited to be with Eli Holder today. Eli, how are you?
I'm good. How are you guys?
Great, thank you. We're excited to have you. You've been doing so many interesting things, a lot on the cutting edge, and I really appreciate your research, so we're excited to speak with you today. For those who haven't come across your work yet, would you mind just giving a quick introduction?
Yeah. So I'm Eli Holder. My firm is 3IAP. 3 is a pattern. I focus on data viz from more of a psychological perspective. So not just what does the data say? What are we making kind of clear, accurate charts? Those are all important and kind of a baseline. But I'm more interested in what do the charts do? What effects do they have? How do they affect people in ways that you wouldn't quite expect from the data? And so the design work and my research kind of overlap a lot in those ways. And so for clients, try to help with issues that can be a little bit more psychologically tough or that involve kind of social psychology. So in particular, equity-oriented data viz. And then the client work also benefits the research because it's up close experience with kind of real world design problems. And so they kind of go hand in hand.
I love that. And often practitioners aren't involved in research, and the practice of design is often downstream from the research, but you're doing both. How did you get into the research side?
So it's always been just kind of a fascination of a lot of my design work previously and a lot of my product work. A lot of the inspiration that I get for things like that came from research, just reading papers and seeing kind of what the underlying kind of theories are for how people approach information or how people approach what they're doing with things or how they think about things. And so I'd always kind of read a lot of research. And then one of the things that's just kind of a fun side hobby is testing things on Mechanical Turk and just seeing how people respond to things. Just because one of the fun things about testing any kind of designs or product or data is just seeing it's the experience of having a design that you're like, yeah, this is going to work. This is going to be great. It's going to be solid. And then you put it in front of somebody and it just absolutely bombs. And it bombs in ways that you don't expect. And you learn a lot from that, but it's also just kind of funny. And so you can get that doing in-person tests. You can also get some of it through Mechanical Turk. You can get it through crowd testing. And so it's a thing that I've done kind of fairly regularly. And then a couple of years ago, I had a client project, a couple of client projects looking at how to show some outcomes split by demographics. And I had a sense that there are ways of doing that right, and then there are ways of doing it that could be kind of sketchy. There were some blog posts on the internet, and there was some writing on it that talked about it as well. And I had one client that was very accepting of trying to do things the right way. I had another client that was very resistant. And I was like, okay, we can just kind of prove this out. And so ran a couple of A/B tests on Mechanical Turk to see, are we seeing the effects that people are worried about? And it turns out that we actually were, and that there wasn't any other research time that showed. And so from there, I started talking to actual academic researchers with some of my results, asking them for like advice on what's the right way to analyze this, what should we do with it. And the community was very encouraging, and almost everybody I talked to was like, we need to publish this. We need to get something. And so with that, what started as, I thought it would be like a blog post maybe of just kind of, these are interesting results, ended up kind of snowballing into like an actual published paper at Viz. And it was a lot of fun. And so I kind of got hooked on it because of that. And so that was a couple of years ago. That was my first paper. I have a new paper out as of October of last year. And then we're working on a third this year. And each are kind of in the neighborhood of data viz and social psychology and how those kind of interact in ways that you might not expect. But like cover slightly different angles of it. So the first was very equity focused. Last year's was looking at the effects of politics and political polls, which are very driven by social psychology, but data viz also has a role to play there. And it's also analogous to some of the equity oriented issues. And then this year we're looking at equity oriented issues for visualizing health outcomes. So a lot of the ways that public health websites will show health outcomes can be a little bit sketchy, I guess. And so we're trying to unpack some of that and figure out better ways to show things and kind of manage some of the side effects that we don't want with, while at the same time, like keeping people informed of health risks, things like that.
So Eli, you have a really broad skill set. You're a really robust researcher. You bring in the psychology, but you started in computer science, I believe you said. Before we dive deeper into your research, could you take us through some of your professional trajectory and how you ended up with your company now doing what you're doing?
Yeah. So my first company out of school, this was a long time ago, but we were doing machine learning before machine learning was what it is now. So this was way before deep learning. We were looking at ways to help people kind of prioritize their email. And so we had the thing in Gmail, like priority inbox. We did that a little bit before them, not as well, and definitely not at the same scale, but we were looking at kind of the same problem. And email as a data set is really interesting because nobody treats their email the same way. So even something simple like the little like star buttons in emails, like everybody has their own kind of unique snowflake way of kind of, I star these things or I don't star these. And that to me was just kind of fascinating in the way that it was revealed in their data was very fascinating. And so this kind of like broader thread of data can be a reflection of people, but data can also reflect back and affect people's behavior. There's a feedback loop there with data. And so that's been kind of just a curiosity and interest, a theme that I think is both interesting from kind of a design and research perspective, but also from a product perspective. And so I've kind of stayed on that path kind of ever since then. And so that got me from computer science and figuring out like, how do we train a model to pick out important email, to just waking up to the psychology of it. And that got me closer to the design side. And then I've kind of just transitioned throughout my career to now being closer to more design, but also being able to lean on computer science and lean on being able to actually like build things and do interactive things, but also the research side as well.
I work with a lot of students and young professionals who often come from tech backgrounds such as computer science and engineering. And when they transition to the design side of things, sometimes they feel that they have to apologize for their former life. But it seems like you've been able to merge those two different sides, the back end and the front end. Could you talk a little bit about how your background in computer science enhances your abilities as a designer?
I think being able to do things in code, being able to do analysis, and I think a lot of analysts now have do a lot more work in R and Python, and I can't imagine being able to really get a sense of what the data actually says or what's in the data without being able to kind of get into the weeds of it and to automate a lot of things like that. And so it helps, I think it helps probably the most with kind of finding stories and with being able to really get into the data, but also for certain things are just easier. Certain topics that are complex sometimes need to be shown interactively, or sometimes need to be more of a tool than kind of a linear narrative story. And so being able to build things out and prototype things quickly also kind of plays a big part in some of my work.
I imagine that knowing what's going on in the back end can help designers understand, is this recommendation a small ask or is it a big ask that's going to make my colleagues' lives miserable for the next month on this project?
Yeah, that can definitely help too.
And a term that you've mentioned a few times is equity. Could you help us understand what equity means when we're talking about data and data viz?
So I mean it in the context of when you report on differences between social groups, a lot of data equity, at least for kind of big institutions, seems to them to mean we're decomposing outcomes by race or gender. And those are the instinct there, I think, is good. Thing that I think is kind of the most important, though, is are you doing things to are you just stopping at decomposing? Are you stopping at descriptively describing differences kind of between groups? Or are you trying to get into the why of it? Are you trying to give enough context? Are you trying to tell a complete story about how different communities have different outcomes and why they have different outcomes and how that's reflective of their community and of society as a whole and of policies and of kind of structural reasons? And so I think the equity-oriented data viz is both how do we kind of report on, how do we help kind of not just close gaps, but kind of improve outcomes for people, but do it in a way that helps people see kind of the complete story around why outcomes are the way that they are for given communities.
So it sounds like equity is both part of the process and part of the product, the ultimate outcome of a design.
I think that's fair. I mean, it can be kind of a broad term, but I think it has to be kind of considered. The more you consider it throughout the process and earlier in the process, the easier everything is.
Okay. This is sort of a thorny question, and I'll be curious if there's anything you know about it. But years ago, when I was training to be an ethnographer, I worked with a professor who introduced us to some research showing that when you go into a site, a research site, and start to watch people, it's important to have a very multidisciplinary, diverse team, because depending on your personal characteristics, your training, ethnicity, language, education, all of those factors, you may notice different things. And based on your own positionality, you might be blind to some things that other people can pick up on. Do you generally find that's true for data science and data viz as well? It's important to have equity and diversity, not just in the analytical process and the outcomes, but in the composition of the team from the very beginning?
Yeah, I think the more we all bring different viewpoints, and the way and a lot of I think the most interesting research, a lot of the interesting research in data viz talks about how you can look at, I don't like the word neutral data set, but you can look at a data set that is just kind of like purely constructed, and people will read things into it based on their prior beliefs. And you can look at the same data set and see entirely different stories just based on your prior beliefs, your prior background. And so if that can happen with consumers, it can definitely happen when you're analyzing the data. There's a study done a few years ago that's fairly well known, but it looked at a range of people across a spectrum of how analytically savvy they were. And they gave them the same data set, but in two different contexts. They told them, in one case, these were outcomes about gun control. Does this intervention help reduce gun violence? In another case, they gave them the same data set and said, this is about skin cream, and does this help kind of reduce blemishes? And so in the skin cream example, because that's politically neutral, it's not a thing that people are really like invested in, almost everybody was able to read that and draw the objectively correct conclusions. When it was the politically charged topic, everybody's conclusions, not everybody, but a lot of people's conclusions just switched to match their priors. So like even when the data set showed this gun control intervention worked, people who were kind of right-leaning just stopped being able to see that, or they started to poke kind of more holes in it than they would have in the skin cream condition. And then in the reverse, when it said that gun control didn't work, people that were more liberal would also kind of question or poke holes in it that they otherwise wouldn't have. And so, what was unique about this study is that they purposely tested across a range of analytical ability. And they found that even when you are kind of more analytically savvy, you're just as prone to seeing things through your own kind of lens as anybody is. And so if that's kind of the case, and just for basic questions around analyzing simple-ish data sets like that, then the more that it gets complex, the more that the assumptions that you have around data can kind of build on each other. And so if you imagine that you're starting from some assumption and that affects maybe the way that you construct the metrics or the way that you build the pipeline, then downstream of that, the things that you see from the data are limited by those previous choices that you've made. And so these assumptions that we make can compound on each other kind of throughout a project. And as that happens within a team, and as the team kind of builds kind of a cultural reflex around what their assumptions are, the assumptions can get kind of even more baked in. Yes. And so as you build things and as you kind of build teams, these early assumptions can kind of build on each other. And so to the extent that you can bring more people in with kind of more backgrounds, more perspectives, the better you are at kind of spotting those things early, and the more just kind of flexible you can be with your analysis and how you kind of see the data, see the world, that kind of thing.
Well, one of the challenges, and you bring up a great point about people's political priors, which are becoming, and have been for a while actually, increasingly important to how people see their own identities and how they interpret the world, including data visualization on sparky topics such as gun control, for instance. Hopefully that doesn't get us flagged by Google. And so as a leader, how do you help manage conflict within teams? Because if you do assemble a really diverse team in terms of political viewpoints, ethnicity, professional backgrounds, ability or disability, there's going to be conflict, I think, if it's a healthy team. How do you help team members work through that and reach a richer level of analysis?
That's a good question. So I think I would be answering this more from my like project experience rather than probably design experience. But I think psychological safety is one of the most important things that you can have on a team for being able to have difficult discussions or to be able to debate things in a way that isn't kind of threatening. And so there's different things that you can do to kind of to create that feeling. I think some of it can be as simple as just like, I've read that there was a study that showed that the more people that speak during a meeting, just the better the meeting feels. And so like they're like even kind of token things like doing meeting warm-ups for just like, how are people feeling today, or kind of emotional check-ins, just getting people into the habit of kind of speaking at the start of the meeting can have like positive snowball effects. But I think most of it comes from the cultural tone that's set by the company, that's set by kind of team leaders, and being open and kind of accepting and really trying to listen and approach things humbly. It also has kind of a pretty big effect on that as well.
Absolutely. At my previous employer, I worked with a wonderful bench scientist who led the most terrifying, but also the most productive group meetings I've ever been a part of, because she was so smart and she wanted us to basically pick different sides and battle it out to see which side would prevail. But she was also very attuned to who wasn't speaking in the meeting. And if she noticed that you weren't speaking up, she would turn her chair and your body towards you, and you think, oh no, it's coming back to me. I better find something to say. But even just little things like that made such a big difference. And I think how the meeting went, and as a team member who often tried to hide in the background and was compelled to speak. And she was also very attuned to things like differences in race and differences in gender, knowing that in the sciences, oftentimes it's the female members of the team who tend to be quieter. I think we were able to move forward a lot more productively with the outcomes, knowing that everyone had spoken, and that we would meet again, and that it wasn't necessarily a high-stakes meeting, but just little things like that, noticing who is speaking and who hasn't spoken, making sure every voice is heard, can make a huge difference in project meetings. But I know you've got some research that you wanted to share with us. What are you working on? What are you excited about?
Yeah,
let's get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple themes that I think about a lot, and two that I think maybe don't get spoken about enough is the first is it's not necessarily what data is in the chart, it's the effect of the chart that I think is kind of doesn't get enough credit. And so there's a fun experiment that I think demonstrates a little bit of that we can walk through. And then another is that when you look at data viz, especially if it's about people, all of our baggage towards other people, everything from social psychology very much applies to how you see people in data viz. And so that's one of the other themes that I think is interesting, and we can unpack that. And then on the topic of politics, the research that we did last year looked at some interesting effects of political polling, and it would be fun to walk through some of that and see what you guys think as well.
Yeah, we're game.
We'll walk through that. Let me get screen sharing going. Okay. So this was a study from the 40s, and where they showed people like a minute-ish clip on television or a minute-ish movie. And I didn't realize that they had TV in the 40s. And so that was kind of one of the first like surprising things, but the effect that they show is really interesting. And so I'm going to put on the video. I want you guys to watch it and then just tell me what you see afterwards. What was the story?
Oh man, I felt what is it called? The Hawthorne effect, where people know they're in an experiment, so they become hyper cognitive and or social desirability bias, where I'm thinking, oh, I want to say something really smart because we're on a podcast with a researcher.
What? No, don't ever think it. Just,
I'm trying to turn off my researcher brain. But at first, it almost reminded me of mice or hamsters, something in a laboratory setting, until that big triangle really started to go to town on that little triangle and act. I mean, I would say kind of violently toward it. And they started to like, oh no, well, like what is going on in this? This experimental cage or whatever. Are these bacteria? Does the big triangle actually gobble everything up like some big paramecium? I don't know. The sudden movements and the movement of the big triangle and the backing away of the little triangle seemed to be, I mean, it made me feel a little bit uncomfortable, even though it's just these very basic shapes on a black and white screen. I felt like I was seeing some kind of violence on a micro level.
Right.
Not sure if that little circle is keeping the game, but I don't know. I guess it was a bystander to that violence of the triangles.
Do you see Edgar?
Yeah, I completely agree. I noticed that the large triangle was aggressively, felt like attacking the smaller triangle. And then I felt confusion as to what the little circle was doing and why it was being ignored in the whole scenario.
Poor circle.
Poor circle. So what's interesting about this is if you imagine aliens come down to the planet and watch this video, really without kind of like our cultural context, without what we just kind of know from the world and interacting with people, like these are just little shapes moving around. It's nothing but kind of two triangles and a circle and a little box. But when people see it, they construct these like very elaborate narratives around what the little shapes are doing. And so not only do we see causality, like the big triangle pushes the little triangle and the little triangle kind of moves away from the big triangle because it was pushed, we also see intent. So we anthropomorphize these tiny little shapes, and we assume that they have agency and that they're within their control. And again, these are just little shapes kind of moving around the screen. And so this is kind of reflective of it's reflective of the way that our brains work when we're processing information. We see these things, they look like a pattern, and we assume kind of causality, we assume these kind of like underlying stories that may not be there. And we do this with data as well. And it's just deeply baked into the way that we see the world. I think they've done kind of similar studies with little kids, and the same thing happens with them. And it gets, a lot of these stories that we fill in can get even more detailed or elaborate when we think it's people. And so the ways that we kind of interpret signals that we shouldn't about other people is very much there and is kind of a thing to kind of keep top of mind. And so the theme that I think is interesting is when we think about data, we want to think about what does the data say strictly versus what is the effect that it has on them. And so I think one of the other interesting things about the video is that like it's not just like an intellectual experience, it's also visceral. Like you said, you felt uncomfortable for one of the triangles. It's a thing that's so deep in our brain, we can sometimes feel it. And so these effects, in addition to the data, I think are just as important, if not more important, than the charts themselves or the data themselves. And so to kind of put that more into the perspective of data viz, this is another chart, another one that would like you guys to weigh in on. So this is a simple bar chart. It shows restaurant worker pay for 4 different groups of people. Group A earns about like $17-ish an hour. Group B earns about $11 an hour. Why do we think that is?
Why do we think that is? Well, the A, B, C, and D, to my mind, implies some sort of sequence or some sort of ranking. And so I wonder, is Group A working a particular shift? Or are they working at a particular restaurant in a high-end part of town? But 4 is sort of interesting. It resists binary thinking. But I assume there's some sort of hierarchy here. Maybe it's levels of experience. What do you think, Andrew?
I was thinking volume of tables. It just depends. Yeah, so because it's restaurant worker pay, it doesn't necessarily imply that they're at the same restaurant or the same type of restaurant. So I was just thinking it was maybe purely volume.
Those are generous answers. Michael, given your ethnography background, I would expect some more of that. The way that a lot of people will answer this, though, is in terms of kind of attributions around the group. So a group A earns more because they work harder, or they offer the best customer service, or they smile more. And we tested charts like this, and these are pretty close to some of the real answers. Whereas the explanation for the differences could actually be a lot closer to what you guys mentioned, which are more environmental. So like, how nice is the restaurant? Is it in a neighborhood that has a lot of foot traffic? What are the ticket prices of the kind of food? Or even like, just is the manager nice to different sets of employees? And so these are more environmental attributions for kind of the causes. But the interesting thing about both of these is we don't have, this chart doesn't tell us anything about like the causality of it. Or it doesn't give us near enough kind of information, but that doesn't stop people from kind of seeing this.
It'd be interesting to run the same test with different colors on the charts. It's interesting that you have them all in gray, but I'm wondering if one line was blue, like light blue, and another line was pink, would I automatically assume it was differences between men and women, or young men, young women? Or what if it was green, or what if it was purple? I wonder if we attach certain associations to certain colors when we're trying to interpret data charts like this.
Yep. So in this, we tested a couple different chart types, and we tested different group types. So we did the abstract letter groups, group A, group B, group C, but we also did racial groups, which have kind of like presupposed meaning. And the overall effect was that people did blame more with one type of chart versus the other, and people blamed more in the letter groups than they did the racial groups. So you mentioned earlier the social desirability bias. So when we did this experiment, we figured that people might pull their punches if we made them kind of explicitly racial groups. And so we tested the abstract groups to kind of get at the sense of blame when you don't have the prior associations about the group. But those prior associations really do make a difference. There's other studies in public health that have looked at differences in health outcomes based on, is the group defined by race, based on, is the group defined by like an urban or a rural split, or is the group defined by education? And the causal stories that people will make up can vary pretty greatly just based on the identity that's kind of, or the type of identity that's associated with the group. And so your hunch there, I think, is pretty spot on. It definitely depends on the types of groups as well.
I think this is a great example of how you addressed ethics in groups. And analysts often, in higher education, they'll categorize lots of different metrics by racial groups. And this brings a very important light to the impact of that, and being thoughtful and considerate with what you're displaying and why you're displaying it, and what some of those presupposed notions that you're bringing to the table when stakeholders are reviewing the data. This is super helpful for me in my design thinking.
Great. Yeah. I mean, this is it's an important thing to kind of keep in mind. And one of the other things that we tested is that the way that you show it can impact some of that.
Yeah.
And so with the bar charts, it's very dichotomized, and it draws these kind of like hard contrasts between groups. But we also tested kind of a range of different charts. And what we found was that when you show kind of more variability within groups, it helps kind of offset some of that it offsets some of the blame that we attribute to different groups, because you can see that it's not their group identity that drives the outcomes. If there's that much variation kind of within groups, then it's hard to draw causal conclusions about kind of the groups themselves. And it helps you to see more, it helps you kind of wake up to the fact that there are other kind of causal upstream things that can drive a lot of this. And so what we found was that these charts on the left actually tend to reduce things like blame or stereotyping, whereas these kind of more dichotomized hard contrast charts on the right tend to increase stereotyping.
I love that. That's incredibly interesting. I'm looking through all the charts.
As kind of another way of the difference in kind of what a chart says. There's a difference between kind of what a chart strictly says and what people will take away from it. And that gets kind of amplified even further when it's about people, because we tend to, at least in Western cultures, this tendency to kind of to blame people and to jump to these personal attributions can be pretty strong as well. But these are essentially just like false causal stories that we, not necessarily false, but like unsupported causal stories that we'll bring to. And so like even the concept of like correlation doesn't imply causation is only like partially true. So when people see, like, it's strictly true from like a logical sense. I think you guys are word nerds, right? And so like if you look at implies from like the definition of like where implies is like entailment, like strictly it logically entails this, I think correlation doesn't imply causation. But if you look at it from the like just perception perspective, like for most people, correlation actually does imply causation because you see it and you can't help but kind of assume these stories. And so the just kind of staying cognizant of what you're showing versus kind of the effect it has, I think is just super important. And that was part of what we're trying to show with this research.
So could you talk a little bit more about how you set up some of these studies? Because considering factors like differences in race, differences in gender, and some of those other individual differences can be really important, especially in fields like public health. But then participants like me will go into a research setting, and we don't want to sound racist. We don't want to sound sexist. We don't want to sound stupid. And so how do you help put participants at ease and get the data that you need to get without embarrassing them or without keeping their guard up? Do you deceive them about what the test is really about, so you catch them by surprise, or do you create just a really comfortable environment and assure them that it's their responses that matter and you're not judging them as a person? What are some of your strategies when you're moderating something like these?
The deceiving them has like ethical implications, and you got to go through review processes, which are hard to do and all that stuff. So it's more around, so I think for these types of tests, because they're online and because it's a crowd test essentially, you have a little bit less of the pressure from I'm speaking to somebody directly. And so that helps a little bit. But it's also with, especially with things like race, a lot of the research that looks at how to kind of measure the effects of racism has shown that you have to approach it kind of indirect. And so some tests of them there's one test that's just looking at like, if you flash like good and bad on a screen and then ask somebody to quickly respond to like which person is associated with those words, there's apparently ways that you can look at just the timing of it will be different based on kind of your perceptions of different types of people. And I haven't looked as closely at studies like that. I think they're a little bit controversial, or there's some nuance to it, I guess. But the overall takeaway is that when you need to get a sense of people's different responses to other people, sometimes you have to be a little bit indirect with it. And so we'll do things like doing letter groups and also testing kind of race groups at the same time to just see what the differences are and if there are differences, and just kind of baking it kind of into the experiment itself to try to sidestep some of that.
Gotcha. And then when you go to a crowdsourcing resource like Mechanical Turk, are those typically unmoderated tests that you just set up, people turn on their computers and cameras and just go for it?
No, it's not even on camera. So a lot of it is just kind of filling out a survey. There are other services where you can get somebody to record things. And actually, I think a lot of times those can be helpful from a designer perspective, where it can be helpful to just see somebody else read your work, see what they interpret, hear them kind of think out loud. And so doing those kinds of tests on video or even in person can be super helpful. For this, where you need kind of a lot of numbers, where you need kind of high volume of people to get up to see the effect size that you're looking for, typically these are going to be more just kind of surveys so that you can get a lot of people through it kind of quickly.
Gotcha. And I appreciate your attention to ethics, which is so important in research design and research implementation. I have deception on my mind because recently with a couple UX students, we started doing a research study that does involve some minor deception, but we submitted it to the IRB. We had someone else look over our shoulder to make sure we're doing things right. And their recommendation sort of surprised me at first, but the more you think about it, the more it makes sense. They said, okay, you can do this study and you can deceive people for good reasons, because otherwise it's impossible to study what you're trying to study. But afterwards, make sure you debrief them, tell them about the study, and give them the chance to withdraw their data. You don't necessarily have to say the results, your interpretations, the conclusions, but do be more forthright afterwards and give them a chance to exclude themselves from the study. just so that they have some sense of agency and you have a little bit more transparency in that sort of research design. What other ethical considerations do you think researchers need to know about as they're trying to optimize data viz? Or what are some serious ethical grievances that you've seen over the years, if you want to go in that direction?
I think so. One of the things, and this gets into the other topic that we looked at last year, is when you show data, it can have effects on people's kind of attitudes and behaviors as well. And so if you read a chart to imply that something is popular with your group versus another group, that can make it more popular. And so a lot of the times that you see like polling charts in the news that look like this, where this is a fake policy of banning canned pet food from Canada. If a dog sees this and he sees that other dogs are like not in favor of it, but cats are in favor of it, you would expect the dog to kind of change their attitudes to be kind of less in favor of this, even if they were kind of neutral prior to. And actually, like in our last study, we showed that this can go all the way to like, we showed that like if you have a dog and a cat looking at like this, like a polarized chart like this, the effect is that they will actually like move away from each other. And so a chart like this can, in a very small way, actually contribute to polarization for like whole group, where like the whole group kind of like diverges apart as they move towards the policies. And so I think one of the bigger ethical considerations, especially for some of this polling stuff, but also in general, is that we have to take responsibility for the effects of our work. It's not, I think a lot of what data viz gets from journalism kind of assumes that your ethical obligation is to be kind of truthful and publish things that are like newsworthy, but that there are still kind of downstream effects. The information that you put out into the world can affect people. And I think that a policy of turning a blind eye to that and just saying like the information that we put out there is accurate and it's clearly presented, those are important things, but you still have an obligation for like, okay, what does that information do? Especially if you're making editorial decisions around what information are we going to look at in the first place? What research are we going to do in the first place? There's all these kind of editorial things that are part of the process that you have kind of control over. And so that implies that you have responsibility for what that information does once it's out in the world. And when we visualize things, we amplify it and we give it kind of even more weight. And so I think one of the bigger ethical considerations is just kind of, as designers, as data communicators, just being more cognizant and being more thoughtful about not just what's the data, but what is the effect of the data? How does it influence people?
So would a best practice be, after you create some sort of visualization for your data and set it out into the world, especially if it's on a topic that is high stakes or important to a lot of people, do follow-up testing so that you know what some of the effects are. Don't just send it out and abandon it.
I mentioned this before, that getting into the habit of testing data is just super important. And it's important for a lot of reasons, but for the perspective of, if you suspect that there are going to be influences that are negative or harmful, especially for some of the equity-oriented charts, putting those out and asking questions that check, does this lead to more blame? Does this lead to more personal attribution? And just running some of that and getting a sense of what is the effect of it is a great way to be able to kind of spot check your designs, but it's also a great way to develop your intuition as a designer for what effects do these charts have. In addition to kind of keeping up with some of the research and reading my blog posts on some of these effects, I think probably the most important thing is, as a community, developing a stronger habit around just testing more of our work kind of regularly.
Okay. Well, what if a designer works in a company that likes to move fast, and the bosses say, well, like I understand that testing is usually important, but we're under deadlines, we got to get things done and out the door. What are some arguments that designers could use to argue for a more balanced, tested, rigorous approach, more ethical approach to data viz? How do you push against the ethic of expediency, I guess you could say? Testing takes time and it takes money.
Yeah, that's a hard question. I was giving a talk last year and somebody asked a question that wasn't a question, it was more of a comment. But they were like, the comment was, urgency is a tool of white supremacy.
Yeah.
And as a recovering product manager, I was like, that's crazy, because urgency is so top of mind, and for anybody who works with clients, getting things done quickly feels kind of so important. But the more that I've thought about it, the more I think that's kind of a compelling argument. As we try to rush through things, we tend to prioritize the things with kind of the most impact. And from a design perspective, the people with the most impact can sometimes be the largest groups. And so as you rush through things, you prioritize the largest groups, you prioritize the dominant groups. And so you by rushing, you can kind of inadvertently reinforce these existing power structures. And so that's kind of like maybe a slightly deeper like ethical argument for it. But I think from a practical perspective, if you need to make a case in kind of like the more businessy way, it makes you a better designer, and it makes you kind of more efficient overall to understand what effect your designs are having. And I think that being able to, it also, like, if you're in the habit of it, it doesn't have to be a big drag. It doesn't have to really cost a lot of extra time or resources. Like, I can get some of these tests up that stood up in like less than. And so if you kind of develop the habit, if you get good at it, it doesn't have to be a long process. And I think even aside from the ethical reasons for doing it, the feedback loop and the learning mechanisms are huge.
And I don't think it needs to be formal tests as well, especially in a business setting, because we often rely on the research of others, right? So I hope Eli writes a book that I can read and then implement all of these practices into my own design, because then in the QA and review process, then I've got the design principles in my checklist or in my mind, and then I'm able to think through like what's the objective and potential downstream effects of this, rather than having to do that testing myself. Similar with lots of data viz, like removing noise and saliency and all of that. I've done zero testing on that, but I've read a lot of research, and so I take those principles and implement it into my own design.
Mm-hmm. And I think so seeing what stuff is out there for, in the case of equity, some advice that's good in other domains around, especially around like simplicity, makes sense if you're talking about kind of stock prices or talking about like rocket trajectories or like physical things. With people, some of the existing advice around like oversimplifying things can be a little bit harmful. And so I think so we need to get more stuff out there on how designing around people is different than designing for kind of other topics. A way that the testing also is important for spotting holes in kind of the existing guidelines. And so it needs to be a balance of both, of just, we've read this somewhere, there's research out there that we can rely on. We've also tested this. And actually, like, as you test kind of more and more things, like, you'll start to you don't necessarily need to retest like a new chart if it looks just like another thing that you've shown. And so you can kind of build up that cultural knowledge yourself within your organization. And so for doing this, the more you can kind of triangulate your feedback, the better. And over time, you learn to do it kind of more efficiently, and it helps your process overall. And so I think it's a good habit to both check the existing research and be familiar with that, but also try to create kind of more direct feedback loops to learn from what you're putting out.
I agree with that. And I hope you write a book, and I hope you call it Visual Effects.
Like,
no, these are such important design principles, because as you've noted, a lot of simplification has turned into oversimplification, and sometimes the context and the objectives and the ethics behind visual communication is lost, especially in data analytics, where we're just moving fast, we're presenting numbers, we're just trying to drive business value, but we do have a large effect, and sometimes we're not cognizant of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of this stuff applies in a business setting as well, where, for example, there's good reasons to show outcomes as jitter plots for kind of stereotyping reasons, but also just for understanding the distribution of whatever you're looking at. It's important to understand that even if it's just like things like sales or other kind of business outcomes, to understand that there's more behind an average, that they're understanding the variability is just as important for kind of decision processes as it is for ethical reasons. And so a lot of this stuff does overlap.
Oh, absolutely. As you were speaking, I was already thinking of studies that I've got my teams doing on specific demographic groups and their outcomes that they're having in higher education. And I was already thinking about how we could provide more context in regards to the variance and the standard deviation and why some members of those groups are successful and some are not, and why the average may be lower. And thinking through those downstream, like the so what and how can we improve outcomes overall, rather than saying like this group has this outcome, full stop, no other context.
Right.
So super helpful.
Great. I hear that.
Well, Eli, it's been such a pleasure. I hope we can speak again. I really do hope you write a book, because I'm going to read it. Because honestly, maybe I live in a cave, but I have not heard a lot of these principles and the thoughtful research and insights that you have anywhere else. And I read a lot. So this is super helpful. Eli, where can people find you?
3iap.com is my firm. I've got most of my writing there, and it's got more of the kind of deeper dives. I've also started a newsletter with Gabby Marie. If you go to, it's called Effect Affect, but the website is effaff.com. And we've got, so with that, we're trying to do kind of quicker hits of data viz research, specifically around like what are the impact or the unexpected impacts that come from data viz. And so we try to highlight a fun study that kind of stands out to us weekly-ish. We haven't quite kept up with that, but we're pretty close. So either 3iap.com or EFF is where you can find most of our stuff.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you again for your time, and I hope to speak with you again soon.
Great. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.